Hello, my name is Fernando. I'm one of the finalists of this year's National Policy Challenge. First, I want to thank the Canadian RDC Network and the Challenge's judges for hosting the event virtually despite the circumstances. Let's start with what I think has been one of the lessons from the past year. When the pandemic started in early 2020, two of the most widespread measures were the lockdowns, which were still experienced, and the calls to keep social distance, which meant staying 2 meters apart from any other person in shared spaces. These measures added a social component to the health crisis. Many individuals and families faced isolation and food insecurity. Rather than social distance, some activists and scholars argued what we needed was social solidarity while keeping physical distance from one another. In this context, accessibility to groceries and basic services became crucial. For those with limited access to income or food, several grassroots initiatives took up in cities like Toronto and Montreal, in what was called the caremongering movement. Like many other aspects of our social life, this kind of volunteer work relies on interpersonal trust. Volunteers must trust each other to coordinate efforts, just as much as food recipients trust them, and vice versa. Despite the abundant research on trust and community development, there is little on the impact that the urban design has on them. This project addresses precisely the relationship between the built environment around us, and particularly the scale of neighborhoods, and its relationship with to the development of interpersonal trust. In the social sciences, we know a lot about the positive outcomes of trust. It reduces risk aversion and allows social cooperation and collective action. We also know that trust is influenced by psychological traits. In my study, I addressed some of the most discussed social conditions of trust, adding a spatial dimension, concretely the influence of the built environment. Trust can be defined as the expectation of good intentions from others. It has a rational component that allows us to predict other people's behavior, but it also is deeply relational, since it's constantly being updated in our interactions. For example, trusting strangers can be deeply affected by a bad experience, such as getting mugged in the street. Now, the literature on trust has identified three main social conditions of trust. First, that we tend to trust people in our inner circle more than those in our outer circle. The two are connected, since our early experiences with different others shape our capacity to generalize trust beyond our family and friends. Second, individuals who take part in voluntary associations usually report higher levels of trust. However, the effect is mediated by how socially diverse these associations are. Finally, there is a positive relationship between trust and what we call informal social ties. That is, people we barely know from informal interactions in the street, especially when walking our dogs or going for groceries. All of these share a common element. Context is important in developing trust, and I will show that here. I will emphasize how the configuration of the built environment affects trust through these social conditions. Thus, I asked whether trust is evenly distributed across different parts of a city or a metropolis. Second, if so, how is this spatial configuration of trust related to the access to urban amenities, ranging from libraries and parks to healthcare and job opportunities? Third, how do the contextual elements interact with other individual predictors of trust, namely participation in voluntary associations and the number of informal social ties? To this, I respond with three hypotheses. First, that trust is especially concentrated in certain parts of the urban landscape. Second, accessible areas foster trust by facilitating informal social interactions. And third, that the presence of urban amenities also fosters trust by creating opportunities for individuals to participate in community-oriented activities such as those promoted by schools, community centers, and the like. The data for this study comes from two major sources. For the variables of interest and other individual controls, I have used the General Social Service surveys microdata from 2008 and 2013. These cycles included multiple questions about trust, social networks, and volunteering. The sample have used aggregate respondents above 18 years of age, living in the top 5 CMAs by population. My analysis grouped the respondents at the census tract level. My second source is a recently released proximity measures database. Statistics Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation made this data available last year. It provides 10 measures of proximity, most of them at walking distance, plus a composite indicator that distinguishes blocks as amenity dense and high amenity dense. The proximity measures were calculated using a gravity model that accounts for the size of the service. These maps show the spatial distribution of the proximity measures composite indicator at the CMA level. We can note that the dissemination blocks with more density of amenities tend to be in the cities within the CMAs, particularly in central areas. We can zoom in a bit more and notice the patterns in each CMA's largest city. There are 4 variables of interest in this study. They are aimed to capture both generalized trust, that is, trusting anybody, and the radius of trust, that is, how inwardly or outwardly oriented respondents' trust towards others is. Generalized trust is better captured by questions that ask whether the respondent trusts strangers. However, experiments show that trust is even better captured when questions provide a specific context. Thus, the second variable of interest draws on whether the respondent thinks it's likely that a stranger would return a wallet with $200 in it. The latter two dependent variables capture the radius of trust by creating a composite indicator of the difference between trusting strangers and trusting neighbors, using both the direct questions and those of the wallet vignette. The independent variables are grouped by level of analysis. At the individual level, I use the respondent's number of non-close friends or acquaintances, and they belong to at least one voluntary association in the past year. I also include other theoretically informed controls, such as population density, length of residence, among others. Given the nested nature of the data, I use multi-level models with random intercepts. The basic idea behind these models is to split the variance at the individual and census tract levels. Since the study involves 5 different CMAs, I also calculated models with three levels of variation, but the interclass correlations showed that the proportion of variance explained by the third level was very low. In other words, the spatial distribution of trust is better explained by intra-city variation. I should note that in the findings, I will also show multi-level models with cross-level interaction terms that are not represented in the equation on the screen. Also, the models using the wallet vignette variable are specified as multi-level logit, not linear. Now let's take a look at some of the findings. First, the 4 outcomes of interest are fairly spatially concentrated. All of them show a spatial autocorrelation of about 0.1 in the Moran's I scale that ranges from -1 to +1. In all 4 cases, the indexes are statistically significant. Here I show a map of the reported trust in strangers in Toronto using census tract centroids and the city's former boroughs. Larger dots and darker colors indicate higher trust. These are some of the model results. Models in orange include interaction terms. Each coefficient represents the estimated effect of the variable's 1 standard deviation unit on trust. If the coefficient falls over the vertical red line, it is not statistically significant. In this plot, we see the models from a first outcome of interest, reported trust in strangers. The effect of the built environment is positively associated with higher levels of trust, and it also has a mediating effect on the other 2 individual predictors of trust. Note that the population density has no significant effect, which suggests that my findings are not simply a function of higher density. In the models using the wallet vignette as dependent variable, the built environment had no significant effect on trust, but a small significant effect on interaction term with acquaintances. The findings using the trust difference variable show one of the strongest effects of the density of amenities on trust. That means a higher density of amenities is correlated with higher outwardly oriented trust. Finally, a similar story can be told with the wallet difference as dependent. Again, broader access to amenities is correlated with more outwardly oriented trust. I want to finish with some remarks regarding my project's implications for policy. First, trust underpins communities. Communities where people trust each other are more resilient. Therefore, the fact that trust is unevenly distributed in cities and metropolises must call our attention. Second, I have shown that trust, especially outwardly oriented trust, is correlated with higher access to urban amenities. These findings suggest that more efforts can be made to promote amenity-dense environments. Finally, cities and provinces can increase their efforts to prevent urban and suburban growth that overlooks the effects on social lives. Policies such as Toronto's Strong Neighborhood Strategy have attempted to improve neighborhoods in need through, among other things, investing in their social infrastructure. I believe there is room for further efforts in this direction. Thank you very much.